They lost everything in one morning, then spent their last $80 on something no one else would touch. Rain clung to the edges of a quiet Ohio street as strangers carried a lifetime out of a small brick house. Leonard stood still, watching it happen. Margaret didn't speak from the truck. She just stared ahead, like she was listening to something no one else could hear. Hours later, with only $80 left, she pointed at a rusted RV no one wanted and said, "That one. If you were in their place, would you have taken that risk or walked away?" It started with the rain. Not a storm, not the kind that sends people running for cover. Just a thin, steady drizzle that clung to everything. The cracked sidewalks, the rusted gutters, the sagging porch rail Leonard Pike had fixed twice with his own hands. The kind of rain that soaks through your coat before you realize it's happening. Leonard stood at the edge of the curb, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. At 76, he didn't move quickly anymore. His knees had stiffened years ago, and there was a carefulness to the way he held himself now, like a man who had learned the hard way that balance was something you could lose. Across the narrow front yard, two men in work jackets carried out a wooden dresser. Leonard watched it go. He didn't say anything. The dresser was heavier than it looked. Solid oak. He'd bought it the year their youngest was born, back when the mill still ran 3 shifts and overtime meant something. One of the drawers stuck on humid days. It had always done that. Margaret used to tug it open with a quick twist of her wrist, like she was solving a small puzzle. Now the drawer slid open as they tilted it, spilling a few loose papers onto the porch. One of the men bent down, picked them up without looking, and shoved them back inside. No one asked if they mattered. Behind Leonard, the old pickup truck idled softly, a low, uneven hum. The engine had been rebuilt once, years ago, and it still carried that slight tremor, like it never quite trusted itself. Margaret sat inside. She hadn't stepped out since they arrived. Through the fogged edge of the windshield, Leonard could see her hands resting in her lap. Still, too still. Her fingers were folded together, knuckles pale, as if she were holding something invisible in place. The driver's window was cracked open just enough for the rain to slip in, one drop at a time. It gathered along the rubber seal and fell onto her sleeve, darkening the wool in small, spreading circles. She didn't brush it away. On the porch, the front door creaked again. Another piece of their life came out. A small table this time, the one that had sat beside Leonard's chair for nearly 40 years. There was a faint ring on its surface where a coffee cup had rested every morning at 6. The mark had never come out, no matter what Margaret used. One of the workers held the door open with his shoulder. The other maneuvered the table down the steps without looking up. They moved like men who had done this before. Efficient, quiet, detached. Leonard shifted his weight slightly. His boots made a soft scraping sound against the wet pavement. He kept his eyes on the table as it disappeared into the back of the truck. Oh. The voice came from behind him. He turned slowly. His eldest son, Daniel, stood a few feet away, holding a folded umbrella he hadn't bothered to open. Water beaded along the shoulders of his jacket, rolling off in small streams. Daniel looked older than Leonard remembered, or maybe just tired. "It's better this way," Daniel said. His tone was calm, measured, like he was explaining something at work. Leonard didn't answer. Daniel glanced toward the house and then back at his father. The taxes alone were getting out of hand, and the medical bills. He trailed off as if the rest didn't need to be said. "We talked about this." Leonard nodded once. A small motion, not agreement, just acknowledgement. From the passenger side of the truck, the door opened. Margaret stepped out carefully, one hand braced against the frame. Her movements were slower now, deliberate, as if each step needed to be decided before it happened. The gravel shifted under her shoes. The rain settled into her hair without resistance. She didn't look at Daniel. Instead, she looked at the house. The windows were already empty, curtains gone. The glass reflecting nothing but gray sky and the faint outline of the river beyond the row of trees. 49 years. That's how long she had walked through that front door. She took a few steps forward, stopping at the edge of the yard. Another worker came out carrying a box of kitchen things, pots, utensils, a chipped bowl with a thin crack running down one side. Margaret's eyes followed it. Not the box. The way it was held, tilted slightly, as if it didn't matter what was inside. Daniel spoke again, softer this time. "Mom, we made sure everything important was taken care of." Margaret turned her head slightly. Not fully, just enough to acknowledge the sound of his voice. "Did you?" she asked. Her voice was gentle, almost kind. Daniel hesitated. "Well, yes. The sale went through. The debts are cleared. That's what matters." Margaret studied him for a moment. Then she looked past him. Her daughter, Elise, stood near the driveway, arms crossed, phone in hand. She wasn't scrolling, just holding it, eyes lowered. Margaret watched her. Waited. Elise didn't look up. A drop of water slid down Margaret's temple, along the line of her cheek, and disappeared beneath her collar. She didn't wipe it away. Another piece of furniture came through the door. A chair this time. Leonard's chair. The fabric had worn thin along the arms, shaped by decades of use. The right side dipped slightly lower than the left. Margaret had tried to fix it once, stuffing extra padding into the cushion, but Leonard had taken it out again, said it didn't feel right. Now the chair looked smaller somehow, out of place like it belonged to someone else. The men carried it down the steps and set it briefly on the porch to adjust their grip. For a moment it sat there, alone. Margaret took one step closer, then stopped. She didn't reach for it, didn't speak. The men picked it up again and carried it away. Daniel cleared his throat. The closing was finalized this morning. The funds have already been distributed. Leonard looked at him. "Distributed," he repeated quietly. Daniel nodded. It was the simplest way to handle everything. Equal shares, clean. Margaret's gaze shifted back to the house. Her eyes moved slowly, taking in each detail. The empty doorway, the scuffed threshold, the place where the screen door used to catch in the summer. She noticed something else, too, something smaller. No one had asked, not once, where they would go. The rain continued, soft, patient, like it had all the time in the world. Margaret turned back toward the truck. She didn't look at Daniel again, didn't look at Elise. She opened the passenger door, climbed in, and closed it with a quiet, final sound. Inside, she placed her hands back in her lap. Folded. Still. Leonard stood there a moment longer, watching the house. Then he turned, walked back to the truck, and got in without a word. The engine trembled beneath them. The workers kept moving, and the rain never stopped. Inside the truck, the air felt smaller than it should have. Damp. Close. The windshield had begun to fog again, softening the edges of everything outside until the house looked like it was already fading. Leonard kept both hands on the steering wheel, though the engine was still idling and the truck wasn't going anywhere. His fingers rested in familiar places, worn smooth over years of driving, thumb near the crack in the plastic, palm pressed where the surface had dulled from use. Margaret sat beside him, looking forward. Not at the house anymore, just ahead, as if there were something there worth focusing on. There wasn't. The passenger door opened again. Daniel leaned in slightly, careful not to drip too much water onto the seat. "Mom. Dad." His voice was softer now, controlled. "We should go over a few things before you head out." Leonard didn't turn. Margaret didn't either. Daniel hesitated, then continued anyway. The sale covered the outstanding balance. The hospital lien is cleared. That was the biggest concern. He spoke like he was reading from a list he'd already memorized. After that, there wasn't much left, but we split it evenly. It just made the most sense. Leonard's grip on the wheel tightened slightly. "How much?" he asked. Daniel blinked. "What?" "How much was left?" Leonard said, still looking straight ahead. A pause. Then Daniel exhaled slowly. "Not much. After everything, about 240. Leonard nodded once. A small, quiet movement. "And that's been handled," Daniel added quickly. "Transferred. It's already done." Margaret shifted her hands in her lap. "Not much. $240. 49 years in that house." She didn't say it. Didn't need to. From the far side of the driveway, Elise finally walked closer. She kept her phone in her hand, but she wasn't looking at it now. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Margaret, then away again. "We made sure everything was taken care of," Elise said. Her voice was lighter than Daniel's, but it carried the same careful tone. "You won't have to worry about bills anymore." Margaret turned her head just enough to see her daughter clearly. There was something in Elise's face. Not guilt, not quite. Avoidance, maybe. Margaret studied it for a moment. Then she asked, very gently, "Where do you think we'll go?" The question settled into the air. No one answered right away. Daniel looked at Elise. Elise looked down. A car passed somewhere down the street, tires hissing against wet pavement. "We talked about Pine Ridge," Daniel said finally. "It's a good facility, clean, staff on site all the time. They can handle everything." Margaret's eyes stayed on him. "Handle what?" she asked. Daniel shifted his weight. "Well, the day-to-day things. Meals, medical. You wouldn't have to worry." Margaret nodded slowly, as if she were taking in the information. "You've already arranged it," she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel hesitated again. "We looked into it, just to be prepared." Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "And us?" she asked. "Did you look into us?" Daniel opened his mouth, closed it again. Elise stepped forward slightly, her voice quieter now. "Mom, we just want what's best for you." Margaret watched her, not with anger, not even with disappointment. Just watching. Behind them, the front door of the house slammed shut. One of the workers called out to the other, something about the last load. Leonard finally turned his head. He looked at Daniel first, then at Elise, then back toward the house. "That's it?" he asked. Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "That's everything," Leonard said. "All the planning, all the decisions." "It's not like that," Daniel replied quickly. "We did this because we had to. You know that." Leonard let out a slow breath through his nose. "I know what you said," he answered. The rain tapped steadily against the roof of the truck. Margaret shifted again, her eyes drifting back to the house, now stripped of anything that had once made it theirs. She noticed something small. The porch light. Still on. It had been left on all day, even in the gray daylight. She had turned that light on every evening for years, before Leonard got home from the mill, before the kids came in from playing in the yard. She watched it now, glowing faintly against the wet siding. No one had turned it off. No one had noticed. "Elise," Margaret said softly. Her daughter looked up. "Yes?" "Did you take the blue quilt from the hallway closet?" Elise blinked. "The quilt?" "The one my mother made," Margaret said, with the hand stitching. Elise shook her head. I don't think so. I didn't go through the closets." Margaret nodded. "All right." She didn't say anything more about it. But she made a small mental note. Something else left behind. Or taken without knowing. It was hard to tell anymore. Daniel glanced at his watch. "We should probably let them finish up. The new owners are coming by later to check everything." New owners. The words landed quietly. Margaret let them sit there. Then she turned back toward the front, folding her hands again. Leonard reached for the gear shift. The movement was slow, deliberate. He didn't look at his children as he did it. The truck shifted slightly as he eased it into drive. "Dad," Daniel started. Leonard didn't stop. "We'll call," Daniel said quickly. "Once things are settled, we'll figure something out." Leonard gave a small nod. Not agreement, just acknowledgement. Margaret didn't turn around, didn't wave. The truck rolled forward, tires crunching softly over wet gravel as it pulled away from the curb. In the side mirror, the house grew smaller. The porch light stayed on. Daniel and Elise stood in the rain, watching them go. Neither of them moved. Inside the truck, the silence returned. Heavier now. Margaret rested her head lightly against the window. The glass was cool against her temple. Raindrops streaked past her reflection, breaking it into pieces. She closed her eyes for a moment. Not to rest, just to think. They hadn't argued. There had been no raised voices, no slammed doors. No one had said anything cruel. And yet, something had ended. Cleanly. Completely. Like a line drawn without hesitation. Leonard drove without speaking, eyes fixed on the road ahead. The town stretched out in front of them. Familiar streets, closed storefronts, the distant outline of the river cutting through it all. Everything looked the same. Nothing was. Margaret opened her eyes again. She didn't look back. The truck moved steadily through town, past places that still recognized them, even if no one inside did. The corner diner with the flickering sign, the hardware store Leonard used to visit every Saturday morning, the narrow street that led down toward the river, where the smell of iron and damp earth always seemed to linger. They passed it all. No one waved. No one noticed. By the time the last row of houses gave way to empty lots and rusted fencing, the rain had thinned to a mist. The sky hung low and colorless, pressing down on everything. Leonard drove without asking where they were going. Margaret didn't suggest a place. There wasn't one. Eventually, the road bent toward the edge of town, where an old lumber yard sat behind a chain-link fence that had long since stopped keeping anything out. The sign at the entrance had peeled down to bare metal. A few stacks of warped boards leaned against one another like they were holding themselves up out of habit. Leonard slowed, pulled in. The tires crunched over gravel and broken wood chips. He parked near the far end of the lot, where the building blocked most of the wind. The engine idled for a moment. Then he turned the key. Silence settled in. Not complete. There were still sounds. A distant train horn, low and drawn out. Water dripping from somewhere overhead. The faint ticking of the engine cooling. Metal shrinking back into itself. Margaret looked around. The place smelled faintly of sawdust and wet wood. It clung to the air, dry and damp at the same time. There was something familiar about it. Something that reminded her of long-ago Saturdays, when Leonard used to bring scraps home for small repairs. She adjusted her coat slightly. "Here's fine," Leonard said. His voice was quiet, not uncertain. "Just finished." Margaret nodded. She didn't ask how long they'd stay. She already knew the answer to that. They wouldn't. Not really. Leonard reached behind the seat and pulled out a folded blanket. It had been there for years, used for hauling things, covering tools, sometimes thrown over their legs on long drives. He shook it out once, spread it awkwardly across both of them. It didn't quite cover. Margaret pulled her side closer. The fabric smelled faintly of oil and old detergent. They sat like that for a while, not speaking, not moving much. Outside, the mist thickened again, blurring the edges of the lumber stacks until they looked like shapes without purpose. Leonard leaned his head back against the seat, closed his eyes. But his hands stayed on his thighs, fingers shifting slightly every few seconds, like they were still counting something. Margaret noticed. She didn't ask what. She knew. Money. Time. Options. All the things that used to fit into a plan. Now reduced to numbers that didn't stretch far enough. After a while, Leonard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. The leather was worn thin at the corners, softened by years of use. He opened it carefully. Counted. Margaret watched without turning her head. 80, he said. The word sat there, simple, final. Margaret nodded once. $80. That was what they had left between them. No house, no plan. Just $80 and a truck that rattled when it idled too long. Leonard closed the wallet and slipped it back into his pocket. "We could get a room," he said after a moment. "Just for tonight." Margaret thought about it. A room meant heat. A bed. A door that closed. She pictured it clearly. Then she pictured the morning after. "How much?" she asked. Leonard exhaled slowly. 50, maybe 60, around here. Margaret did the math without moving her lips. 80 minus 60. 20. Maybe less. She shook her head gently. "Not tonight," she said. Leonard didn't argue. He just nodded. The decision settled between them, quiet and understood. The air grew colder as the hours passed. Margaret pulled the blanket higher, tucking it around her shoulders. Leonard shifted slightly, trying to make space where there wasn't much to begin with. The seat didn't recline far enough. The angle wasn't right. Nothing about it was meant for sleeping. Margaret closed her eyes anyway, listened. The ticking of the engine faded. The drip of water slowed. Somewhere in the distance, a loose sheet of metal clanged softly in the wind. Leonard shifted again. Margaret opened her eyes just enough to see him. He was staring straight ahead, not blinking. "You should try to sleep," she said quietly. He didn't look at her. "I will." But he didn't. Minutes passed, then more. Margaret closed her eyes again, but her mind didn't follow. It stayed awake. Moving. Turning things over. The house, the conversation, the way Daniel had said distributed, the porch light still on, the blue quilt. Small things. Details. They came back one at a time. She listened to Leonard's breathing. It wasn't steady, too shallow, too alert. Like a man waiting for something he couldn't name. Margaret shifted slightly, careful not to disturb the blanket too much. She leaned her head against the window again. The glass had grown colder. The mist outside had turned to fine droplets, catching what little light there was and holding it in place. She watched them for a while. Then she noticed something else. Leonard's hand, still resting on his thigh, but the fingers had stopped moving. Not relaxed, just paused. She reached over slowly and placed her hand over his. He flinched, just slightly, then stilled. "I'm here," she said. Simple, nothing more. Leonard turned his head a fraction, looked at her. In the dim light, his face seemed older. Not from years, from something else. "I know," he said. His voice was quieter now. Margaret squeezed his hand once. Not tightly, just enough. Thus she left it there. The night stretched on. At some point, Leonard's eyes closed. Not fully, but enough. Margaret stayed awake longer. Listening, watching, waiting for something to settle. It didn't. Not completely. By the time the first gray hint of morning began to edge into the sky, the cold had worked its way through the blanket and into their bones. Margaret hadn't slept. Not really. Leonard stirred beside her, shifting stiffly as he straightened up. His neck cracked softly. Neither of them spoke. The lumberyard looked different in the early light. Smaller, more empty. Margaret sat up slowly, her joints protesting the movement. She rubbed her hands together, trying to bring some warmth back into them. Leonard reached for the key, paused, then turned it. The engine coughed once, twice, then settled into its uneven hum again. Margaret looked out through the windshield. The day ahead waited, blank, unanswered. She didn't know where they were going, but she knew one thing. They couldn't stay here. Leonard shifted the truck into gear, the engine giving a tired shake before settling into its rhythm. The tires rolled slowly over the gravel, crunching through the damp wood chips as they pulled out of the lumberyard and back onto the road. Morning hadn't fully arrived yet. The sky was still a dull gray, like it hadn't decided whether it was worth brightening. Margaret sat upright now, her hands resting in her lap again, not as still as before. Her fingers moved slightly, pressing into one another, as if feeling for something. Neither of them spoke. The road stretched ahead in long, empty lines. They passed a few early cars, a delivery truck, a man walking a dog near a row of small houses. Ordinary things. Everything felt ordinary. Except it wasn't. After a few miles, Leonard cleared his throat. "There's a county sale today," he said. "Surplus yard, out past Mill Creek." Margaret turned her head slightly. He kept his eyes on the road. Old equipment, seized vehicles, sometimes tools. Might be something we can use. Margaret nodded once. It wasn't hope, just direction. They drove another 20 minutes before the road narrowed and curved toward an open lot surrounded by rusted fencing. A faded sign leaned crooked near the entrance. County Surplus Auction, today. A handful of trucks were already parked along the edges. Men stood in small groups, hands in pockets, coffee cups steaming in the cold air. The smell of oil and damp dirt mixed together, thick and familiar. Leonard parked off to the side. The engine ticked as it cooled again. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Margaret opened her door. The cold air hit sharp. She stepped out carefully, her shoes pressing into the soft ground. Leonard came around the front of the truck, his joints stiff, his shoulders tight. They didn't walk together. Not at first. They moved slowly through the lot, side by side but slightly apart, like they were each seeing it for themselves. There were rows of things no one wanted. A cracked fishing boat with peeling paint, a line of dented toolboxes, a forklift missing a tire, a stack of metal shelving bent out of shape. Men moved past them quickly, stopping here and there, checking, calculating. Leonard watched them. He knew the look. He'd worn it himself for years, measuring value, weighing cost against usefulness. Now it felt different. Now it felt like guessing. Margaret walked more slowly. She wasn't looking for value the way Leonard was. She was looking at details. The way something had been used. The marks left behind. She paused near a small trailer, running her fingers along a groove in the metal, not damage. Wear. Repeated movement. Then she moved on. Further back, near the edge of the lot, where the ground turned uneven and weeds pushed through the gravel, something caught her eye. She stopped. Leonard took a few more steps before noticing. "Margaret?" he called softly. She didn't answer right away. He turned and followed her gaze. At first it looked like nothing, just another shape among shapes. Then he saw it. An old RV. Long, boxy, paint faded to a dull, uneven white that had yellowed in patches. One side leaned slightly lower than the other, a tire half sunken into the dirt. Vines had climbed up along the wheel well, curling into the edges like they'd been there for years. It sat apart from everything else. Not grouped, not displayed, almost like it had been pushed there and forgotten. Leonard frowned. "That thing's finished," he said quietly. Margaret stepped closer. The ground softened under her feet. She didn't touch it right away. She walked around it once, slowly. Leonard followed, though he kept a bit of distance, hands in his coat pockets. Margaret stopped near the side panel. She leaned in slightly. Her fingers lifted, hovering just above the surface before making contact. The metal was cold, rough in some places, smooth in others. She moved her hand along it, then paused. There were marks. Not random, not from weather. Long, shallow scratches near a seam in the panel, repeated in the same place. Her fingers traced them carefully. Then she looked at the hinges just above. They were worn down more than the rest. Used, opened and closed, again and again. Margaret stepped back slightly, studying the shape of that section. Not a door. Something else. Leonard watched her. "What is it?" he asked. Margaret didn't answer right away. She moved toward the front, then back again, looking at it from a different angle. The placement didn't make sense for storage. Too high, too narrow. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Someone stood here," she said finally. Leonard blinked. "What?" "Here," she repeated, placing her hand near the worn section. They stood in one place, over and over. Leonard stepped closer now, looking where she pointed. It just looked like damage to him. Or age. Margaret shook her head slightly, as if dismissing that thought. "No," she said softly, "not damage." She looked up at the panel again, at the seam, at the hinge. Something about it stayed with her. Leonard exhaled. Even if it ran, it'd cost more to fix than it's worth. Margaret didn't look at him. "How much do we have?" she asked. Leonard hesitated. 80. Margaret nodded. She stepped back again, taking in the whole RV, the sag in the frame, the broken trim, the stillness of it. Then she looked at Leonard. "Buy it." The words were quiet, but clear. Leonard stared at her. "That thing?" he asked. She didn't blink. "Yes." A short laugh came from somewhere behind them. One of the other men shook his head as he passed. "You'd have to pay me to take that," he muttered. Leonard glanced toward the sound, then back at Margaret. "Margaret," he started. She held his gaze. Not stubborn, not emotional. Certain. Leonard had seen that look before. Not often, but enough. It was the same look she'd had the night they decided to take a second mortgage to send their daughter to college. The same look when she'd told him to leave the mill early after his chest pains started. She didn't explain. She didn't argue. She just knew. Leonard looked back at the RV, then down at the ground, then at his hands. $80. Everything they had. He let out a slow breath. "All right," he said. Margaret didn't smile. She just turned slightly, stepping back from the RV as if the decision had already been made long before he said it out loud. The auctioneer's voice rang out from the front of the lot, calling people in. Leonard took one last look at the RV, then he followed the sound. The auction moved quickly. Voices overlapped. Hands lifted in small, almost invisible gestures. Numbers rose and fell without ceremony. Most of the items were gone before Leonard fully registered what they were. He stood near the back, arms crossed, watching, waiting. Margaret stayed where she was, near the RV. She didn't follow the crowd, didn't seem interested in anything else being sold. Her eyes stayed on that same section of metal, the worn hinges, the faint scratches. She wasn't thinking about price. She was thinking about use. When the auctioneer finally reached the far edge of the lot, his voice changed slightly. Less energy, less expectation. "Last item," he called out. "Lot 42. A few men turned their heads. Most didn't. The auctioneer gestured lazily toward the RV. Old recreational vehicle. No paperwork. Been sitting for years. Selling as is. A pause. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Who'll start me at 50, No one spoke. A man near the front shook his head, already turning away. 40? The auctioneer tried. Silence. 30? Someone laughed under their breath. Leonard felt it then, that familiar shift. The moment when something unwanted became invisible. The auctioneer sighed. 20. Still nothing. Leonard glanced back toward Margaret. She hadn't moved. She was watching him now. Not the RV. Him. Her expression didn't change, but there was something in it. Not pressure. Not hope. Just expectation. Leonard turned back. 16, he said. His voice carried farther than he expected. A few heads turned. The auctioneer blinked once, then nodded. 16 I have. Anyone want to go higher? No one did. A man behind Leonard muttered something about scrap weight. Another shrugged. 16 going once, the auctioneer said. Leonard felt his pulse in his throat. Going twice. A beat. Sold. The gavel came down with a dull crack against a metal surface. It was done. No applause, no reaction, just another item cleared. Leonard stood there a moment longer, as if waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. He turned and walked back toward Margaret. It's ours, he said. Margaret nodded. Again, no smile, just acceptance. They didn't celebrate, didn't speak much at all. Leonard paid in cash. The bills felt thinner than they should have, lighter. $64 left. The number stayed with him. They waited until most of the lot cleared before approaching the RV again. A man with a clipboard handed Leonard a slip of paper without much interest. No keys, he said. You'll have to figure that out yourself. Leonard nodded. Of course. They stood beside it now. Up close, it looked worse. Paint flaking, rubber seals cracked, a faint line of rust tracing the edges of the panels. Leonard ran his hand along the front. Cold, solid. Think it'll run? Margaret asked. Leonard shook his head slightly. Not today. He walked around to the driver's side, peering through the dusty window. The interior was dim, shapes barely visible through layers of grime. Doors might be stuck, he added. Margaret moved toward the side, toward that same panel, the one she'd noticed before. She reached for the handle, pulled. It didn't budge. She tried again. Harder. The metal groaned slightly, but held. Leonard stepped closer. It's probably swollen shut. Been sitting too long. Margaret nodded, but she didn't let go. Instead, she shifted her grip, placed her other hand along the edge, pulled with both. The seal gave a little this time. A faint crack. Not much, but enough. She paused, adjusted her stance, then and pulled again. This time the door broke loose with a sharp, hollow pop. It swung outward a few inches before stopping. A rush of air came out. Stale. Thick. Leonard stepped back instinctively, raising his hand slightly. Margaret didn't. She stood there, holding the door, letting it open slowly. The smell came first. Not just damp, not just mold, something else. Faint. Buried underneath. Grease, old, cooked grease, and something softer, like flour, like something that had once been warm. Margaret breathed in carefully. Once. Twice. Her eyes narrowed slightly. That's not from sitting, she said. Leonard frowned. What? She didn't answer. Not yet. She pulled the door open wider. Light from the overcast sky slipped inside, cutting through the darkness in thin gray strips. Shapes began to form. Not seats, not the usual layout of an RV. Margaret reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small flashlight. She clicked it on. The beam cut through the dust. And then she saw it. A metal surface. Flat. Running along one side. Not decorative, not storage. A counter. Her breath caught slightly. She stepped up into the doorway. Leonard followed, slower this time. The floor creaked under their weight. Margaret swept the light across the interior. There were no couches, no beds. Instead, more metal, shelving, hooks along the wall. A vent cut into the side panel above where she'd noticed the hinges. Leonard stepped in behind her. "What the?" he murmured. Margaret moved further inside. The smell grew stronger, not unpleasant, just old. Her light passed over a corner. There, a rectangular opening, framed, sealed shut from the inside. She stepped closer, touched the edges, the same hinges, the same wear. "It opens," she said quietly. Leonard looked at her. "What does?" She didn't look back. "This side," she said, tapping lightly on the panel. "From the outside." Leonard frowned. Why would... He stopped. Because now he saw it too. The placement, the height, the counter beneath it. Margaret lowered the flashlight slightly. Her voice was softer now. "Certain." "This wasn't for living," she said. Leonard said nothing. Margaret turned her head just enough for him to see her expression. This was for serving. The words settled into the space. Heavy. Real. Leonard looked around again. Not as a buyer now, as someone trying to understand. The shelves, the hooks, the vent. It all lined up. He exhaled slowly. "Someone worked out of here," he said. Margaret nodded. Her hand rested lightly on the counter. She ran her fingers along it. There were marks. Not damaged use, years of it. She closed her eyes for a moment, just to feel it. Then opened them again. The RV wasn't just old. It wasn't just broken. It had been something. Something specific. Something repeated. Margaret stepped back toward the door, looked out across the empty lot, then back inside. "We didn't buy junk," she said quietly. Leonard didn't answer. He was still looking around, trying to see what she saw. Margaret stepped down from the RV. Her boots hit the damp ground. She turned once more, looking at the open doorway, at the darkness inside, at the faint smell still drifting out. Something had been left here. Not just things, something else. She could feel it. Not clearly, not yet, but it was there, waiting. Leonard climbed down beside her. They stood in silence for a moment. Then he nodded once. "We'll figure it out," he said. Margaret didn't respond. She just kept looking at the RV, as if it hadn't told them everything yet. The lot had nearly emptied by then. Engines started and faded into the distance. The men who had gathered earlier were already gone, hauling away whatever they had come for. What remained felt quieter now, less like a sale, more like something left behind. Leonard stood beside her, hands on his hips, eyes moving slowly across the RV again. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Margaret didn't answer right away. She stepped forward, back to the door, back inside. The air hadn't changed much, still stale, still thick with that strange mix of grease and something softer beneath it. She lifted the flashlight again, swept the beam across the counter, the shelves, the hooks. This time she moved slower, more deliberate. She wasn't just looking anymore. She was searching. Her fingers brushed along the edge of the counter, pushing aside a thin layer of dust. It came away in soft streaks, revealing dull metal underneath. There were more marks here. Faint grooves, circular patterns, like bowls or pots had sat in the same place over and over again. She followed the line of the counter down to the far end. There, tucked into the corner, was a small metal box. Hinged, closed. Margaret crouched slightly, her knees stiff. She placed her fingers under the edge and lifted. It stuck for a moment, then gave way with a dry click. Inside, paper. A stack of it. Yellowed at the edges. Margaret reached in and lifted the top piece carefully. It was a card. Handwritten. The ink had faded, but it was still readable. Flour. 5 cups salt. 1 teaspoon shortening. 1/2 cup milk. Enough to bind. Her eyes moved slowly across the lines. A recipe. Simple. Practical. Used. She turned the card over. Nothing on the back. Leonard stepped closer behind her. What is it? Recipe, she said. Her voice was quiet. Not surprised. Almost expected. She set the card aside and reached for the next. Another recipe. Then another. Each one written in the same careful hand. No decorations, no extras, just instructions, measured, precise. Margaret held one up to the light, studied the handwriting. There was a rhythm to it. Certain letters looped the same way. Certain strokes pressed harder than others. She noticed that. Stored it away. She set the cards down on the counter, looked around again. If there were recipes, there had to be more. She turned slowly, letting the beam sweep across the far wall. Something caught the light. Faint. Uneven. She stepped closer, raised the flashlight higher. There, beneath the dust, beneath years of it. Letters. Painted. Margaret reached out with her sleeve and wiped a small section clean. The dust came away in a thin cloud. Blue paint. Faded. But still there. She wiped again. More letters appeared. D. She paused. Her hand hovered, then continued. Margaret leaned in slightly. Her breath slowed. She cleared more of the surface, until the word stood clear. IDAs. She stepped back half a step. Leonard moved beside her now. What does it say? He asked. Margaret didn't look at him. She wiped further. Another word beneath it. T. L. E. Ida's table, she said softly. The name settled into the space, like it had been waiting. Leonard stared at it. Who's Ida? He asked. Margaret shook her head slightly. I don't know. But she wasn't finished. Not even close. She turned back to the counter. Gathered the recipe cards, stacked them neatly, then looked lower. Along the base, there were drawers. Narrow, almost hidden. She pulled the first one open. Empty. The second, a few rusted utensils. Nothing more. The third, stuck. She pulled harder. The wood creaked, then slid open with a sudden jerk. Inside, a notebook, thicker than the recipe cards. Bound. Margaret lifted it carefully. Dust fell away in small, soft puffs. She set it on the counter, opened it. The pages were filled, not recipes, names, rows of them. Each written in the same careful hand. Beside each name, dates, short notes. Margaret leaned closer. Read one. Tommy. Extra gravy. Doesn't ask twice. Another. Mrs. Kell. Soft bread only. Teeth. Another. Jared. Comes late. Save plate. Margaret turned the page. More names. More notes. Different handwriting pressure in places, but the same person. Always the same person. Leonard stepped closer, peering over her shoulder. "What is that?" he asked. Margaret didn't answer immediately. Her finger traced one of the lines. Slowly. She remembered them, Margaret said. Leonard frowned. Who? Ida. She turned another page, then another. The names kept going. Dozens, maybe more. Each one with something beside it. Something specific. Not just food. People. Margaret's eyes moved faster now, scanning, looking for patterns. She flipped toward the back. The dates changed, spread out, then stopped, mid-page. The writing ended. Abrupt. As if the pen had been lifted and never set down again. Margaret stilled. Her hand rested lightly on the page. There was something else. A fold. Near the back cover. She slipped her fingers underneath it. Carefully. Pulled it free. A piece of paper. Different from the rest. Not a card. Not a page from the notebook. Something separate. She unfolded it slowly. The paper was fragile. Soft with age. Leonard leaned in slightly. What is it? Margaret read silently at first, her eyes moving across the lines. Then she spoke. If you're reading this... Her voice was quieter now, more focused. I didn't make it back. Leonard's expression changed. Slightly. Margaret continued. There's one more stop. I meant to go. I always meant to go. She paused. The rest of the page was shorter, less steady. If someone finds this, don't forget them. Margaret lowered the paper slightly. There wasn't much more. Just a few words at the bottom. Faded. Incomplete. She turned it toward the light. Tried to read the last line. End of River Road. Then nothing. The ink had trailed off. Leonard let out a slow breath. She never went back, he said. Margaret didn't answer. Her eyes moved from the paper, to the notebook, to the name on the wall. Ida's table. She folded the paper carefully, placed it beside the notebook, then looked around the RV again. This time, everything felt different. Not just a space, not just a structure, a pattern, a purpose, interrupted. Margaret rested her hand on the counter again, the same place she had touched before. Only now, she understood what it had been used for. Leonard stepped back toward the door. What do you think happened? He asked. Margaret didn't turn. She looked at the wall, at the name, at the faded paint. I don't know, she said. Then, after a pause, we'll find out. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Leonard looked at her for a long second, then gave a small nod. Not because he understood everything she was seeing, but because he recognized the tone. She had already decided. They stayed in the RV longer than they meant to. The light outside shifted, turning flatter, colder. The lot had emptied completely now. What remained was stillness, the kind that made every small movement sound louder than it should. Margaret gathered the papers carefully. The recipes first, then the notebook, then the letter. She stacked them in a neat pile and held them close to her chest for a moment, as if testing their weight. Not heavy, but not light either. Leonard cleared his throat. We should move it before it gets dark. Margaret nodded. They worked without speaking much. Leonard found an old chain near the back of the lot, rusted but usable. It took time to secure it properly. His hands were slower now, less certain than they used to be, but the motions came back to him in pieces. Habit filled in the rest. The truck strained when he first pulled. The RV didn't move, not at first. Then the chain tightened. The tires shifted. And slowly, reluctantly, the RV began to roll. It creaked as it moved, metal against metal, a long, unused thing waking up. Margaret walked beside it, one hand lightly resting against the side panel as if steadying it. They didn't go far. Just back to the lumber yard, the same place they had spent the night before. Only now they had something with them. Leonard parked the truck again, engine idling low. The RV sat behind them, angled slightly, uneven but upright. Margaret climbed inside before Leonard had even shut the door. The air was colder now. Darker. But it didn't feel empty anymore. She set the papers down on the counter, spread them out, one by one. The notebook in the center, the letter beside it, the recipe cards off to the side. Leonard stepped in behind her. "What are you looking for?" he asked. Margaret didn't look up. "A pattern," she said. She opened the notebook again, flipped back to the first page, started reading. Not just the names. Everything. Dates, spacing, the way entries were grouped. She moved slowly at first, then faster, her finger tracing lines, stopping, going back. Leonard leaned against the doorframe, watching her, not interrupting. After a while, Margaret reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. An old county map, creased from being opened and closed too many times. She laid it flat on the counter, smoothing the edges with both hands. Then she looked back at the notebook and began. She found the earliest entries, checked the dates, marked a point on the map, then the next. Another mark. Her movements became more certain, more deliberate. She wasn't guessing anymore. She was matching. Leonard stepped closer now, watching the marks appear. "Those where she went?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "Looks like it." She turned a few more pages. Marked again. The pattern began to form. A loose loop through the county. Main roads first, then smaller ones, then the river road. Margaret paused there, her finger resting on one of the entries. "River," she murmured. Leonard leaned in slightly. "What?" She flipped to the letter, unfolded it again. "Read the last line, end of River Road." She looked back at the map, followed the river line with her finger. Slowly, until the road narrowed, turned, then ended. There. Nothing marked. No entry. No name. Just a blank space where the map faded into the edge of the paper. Margaret tapped the spot lightly. She never wrote it down, she said. Leonard frowned. Maybe she didn't get there. Margaret nodded once. That's what she said. She looked back at the notebook. Flipped to the last pages again. The writing grew less steady there. Spacing uneven, dates further apart. Then nothing. Stopped. She placed her hand flat over the page. She meant to go, Margaret said quietly, but she didn't. Leonard crossed his arms. Could have been anything. Got sick. Broke down. Who knows? Margaret didn't argue. She didn't need to. She looked at the map again, then back at the notebook, then at the RV around them. All of it connected. Not in a straight line, but close enough. She went everywhere else, Margaret said. She kept track of everyone. Leonard nodded, and she wrote it all down. Margaret looked at him now. That's not something you stop doing on purpose. Leonard held her gaze, then looked back at the map, at the empty space, the unmarked end, the silence in the notebook. He exhaled slowly. What are you thinking? He asked. Margaret folded the letter carefully, placed it back on the counter. Then she picked up the notebook. Closed it. I'm thinking, she said. Someone's still there. The words hung between them. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just real. Leonard didn't respond right away. He looked toward the front of the RV, out through the dusty windshield, at the darkening yard beyond, then back at Margaret. You want to go? He asked. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She turned back to the map, traced the route again. Every stop, every mark, until her finger reached the end and stopped. She rested it there, for a long moment, then lifted her hand. We will, she said. Not tonight, not yet, but soon. Leonard nodded. He understood that much. Margaret gathered the papers again, neatly, carefully, like they mattered. Because now, they did. Outside, the light had almost gone. The air pressed colder against the sides of the RV. Leonard stepped down first, then turned to help her. She took his hand, stepped out, but before she let go, she looked back. Inside the marfon, at the counter, at the notebook, at the faint blue letters on the wall, Ida's table. The name didn't feel like a memory anymore. It felt like something unfinished. Margaret released Leonard's hand, closed the door gently, and stood there a moment longer in the quiet, looking toward the road. The wind moved through the empty lumber yard in slow, uneven breaths, carrying the smell of wet wood and distant river water. Margaret pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, but she didn't step away. Not yet. Behind her, Leonard closed the tailgate of the truck with a soft, final thud. He lingered beside it, watching her, not calling her back, not rushing her forward. He had learned that much. When Margaret stopped like this, there was a reason. Finally, she turned. Not toward the RV, not toward the truck, toward the small portable stove they had pulled from the back earlier that afternoon. It sat on a crate now, uneven but steady enough. Leonard followed her gaze. You're cold, he said. Margaret shook her head once. No. Then, after a moment, we should cook something. Leonard frowned slightly. Now. Margaret nodded. He didn't argue. They didn't have much. A small bag of flour, a bit of shortening wrapped in paper, salt, and just enough water. Margaret moved slowly, setting things out with care, as if the space itself mattered. Even here, in a broken yard, beside a truck and an RV that barely stood straight. Leonard watched her hands. They were stiff, the joints swollen slightly from years of work, but steady. Always steady. She mixed the dough in a dented bowl, her fingers pressing and folding with quiet familiarity. No wasted movement, no hesitation. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at the edges of her coat. Leonard stepped closer, blocking part of it without thinking. Margaret didn't look up. She just kept working. When the dough was ready, she flattened it with the heel of her hand against a scrap of clean board Leonard found nearby. No rolling pin, no tools, just pressure, just memory. Leonard lit the stove. The flame flickered weak at first, then steadied. Margaret placed the pan over it. Waited. She didn't rush. She knew the moment when it was ready, when the heat settled into the metal just right. Then she placed the first piece of dough down. It sizzled, soft at first, then sharper. The smell came quickly, warm, simple. Flour and fat turning into something more. It spread through the yard in a slow, steady wave. Leonard leaned back slightly, breathing it in. It had been a long time since anything smelled like this. Margaret flipped the bread once, then again. Golden in spots. Uneven. Perfect. She set the first piece aside and placed another down. The rhythm came back to her. Quiet. Familiar. Leonard sat on the edge of the tailgate, watching. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The smell carried further this time. Beyond the yard. Beyond the fence, out to the road. Margaret noticed it before Leonard did. A shape at the edge of the gravel, still, watching. A boy, maybe 10. Too thin for his age. His hands tucked into sleeves that were too long. He didn't step forward. Didn't say anything. Just stood there. Margaret kept cooking. She didn't call out. Didn't wave. She flipped another piece. Then another. The boy shifted slightly. Took one step closer. Then stopped again. Leonard noticed now. He turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing. Margaret spoke quietly, without looking up. Let him come. Leonard didn't move. The boy hesitated, then took another step. And another. Until he stood just at the edge of the light from the stove, close enough to smell it fully. Still not speaking. Margaret reached for one of the finished pieces, broke it in half, then placed it on a piece of paper she had found earlier. She turned. Held it out. Careful, she said. It's hot. The boy didn't take it at first. He looked at her, then at Leonard, then back at the food. Margaret waited. No pressure, no hurry. Finally, the boy stepped forward and took it. Quickly. Like he might change his mind if he didn't. He didn't say thank you. Didn't need to. He ate standing up. Fast at first, then slower, like he was remembering how. Margaret watched him. Not his face. His hands. The way he held the food. Carefully. Like it mattered. Leonard shifted slightly on the tailgate. Said nothing. After a moment, another shape appeared behind the boy. A woman. Thin. Tired. Holding the hand of a smaller child. She didn't come closer right away, just stood there, watching. Margaret didn't look at her. Not directly. She placed another piece of bread on the paper, then another. Set them aside. Close enough. Available? The woman stepped forward slowly. The smaller child clung to her coat. Margaret spoke again. Same tone. Same quiet steadiness. There's enough. That was all. No questions. No explanation. The woman nodded once. Came closer. Took the food. Thank you, she said, barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded back. Nothing more. The boy had already finished his. He looked at the second piece Margaret had set aside. Hesitated. Margaret didn't say anything, just nudged it slightly closer. He took it. This time slower, more careful. Leonard watched the whole thing. His expression didn't change much, but something shifted behind it. Something quiet. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Margaret kept cooking. More dough, more bread. The rhythm didn't stop. More people came. Not many. 2, then 3. Drawn by the smell, by the quiet. No one spoke loudly. No one asked questions. They took what was given. Stood. 8 left. Margaret noticed everything. Who took one piece, who took 2, who hesitated, who didn't. She stored it all. Not consciously. Just naturally. Like she had done before. In another place, another life. Leonard stood now, moved closer to the stove. Margaret, he said softly. She looked up. He gestured slightly toward the RV. You're doing it again. Margaret followed his gaze. To the open door. To the counter inside. To the faded blue letters on the wall. Ida's table. She looked back at the people. At the boy. At the woman. Then down at her hands. Still working. Still steady. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because Leonard was right. She was. The last piece of dough went into the pan. The flame flickered lower. The air grew colder again. But something had changed. Not the place, not their situation, something else. Margaret set the final piece aside, looked out toward the road again. This time, it didn't feel empty. Margaret stood there, hands still dusted with flour, watching the last of them drift back toward the road. No one lingered. No one made a scene. But they left different than they came. Fed. Seen. For a long while she said nothing. Just listened to the quiet settling back in. Only now it wasn't hollow. It carried something. Warmer. Like the space remembered what had just happened. She hadn't planned any of it. Not the stove, not the bread, not them. At the house everything had been counted. Debts, square footage, what could be divided and signed away. It all made sense on paper. But standing here, beside a rusted truck and a broken-down RV, she realized something didn't fit that kind of math. Ida hadn't left behind a kitchen. She'd left behind a pattern. And Margaret, she had followed it without even knowing. She looked at Leonard. He didn't say anything either. Just nodded once like he understood. Because somehow, in losing the place they were supposed to belong, they had stepped into something that was already waiting. So tell me, when was the last time something you almost walked past was actually the thing meant for you?